Kia ora koutou. My name is Annabelle Pretty, Senior Lecturer at the School of Architecture, Unitec, and I'll be presenting the paper co-written with Dr. Manfredini from the School of Architecture and Planning, the University of Auckland, both in New Zealand. The title of our paper is Ambiguous, Assemblage, Sublime Architectural Narratives. Hyperreal architecture assemblages are pervading our daily experience and progressively disrupting our spatial practices. Thought-provoking paradigms using VAM, or virtual, augmented and mixed realities, deeply transform our perception of space, ascribing new spatial qualities to architecture, instantaneously activating digital spatial transductions, juxtapositions, superimpositions, and permutations that blur the elements of the incompatible systems, producing spatial assemblages with powerful emergent properties. Much earlier than digital augmentations, creative practices have widely experimented with these hyperspatialities. Numerous architects, artists, and photographers have used representational means to produce spatial speculations in the form of transductive, ambiguous assemblages. Laurent Chaher, Dionysius Gonzalez, and Naomi Goodall, to name a few, have revolutionized reality by creating, manipulating spatial qualities that redefine the way we conceive and perceive space. These are hyperreal follies of imaginable futures that offer sublime, translocated detourializations. Using the most accurate art of reproduction, photography, as an instrument to investigate the power of hyperreality, this paper aims to shed light on the fundamental connections between analog and the digital creative experimental practice in the production of sublime architectural assemblages. Sublime follies can embody both the fabulous speculations and perhaps the awful reinterpretations of spatial qualities. Within this paper, they are always manifest as the uncontextualized hyperreal building within the landscape. These sublime follies being manifestly disembodied from their original context, sublime, both providing beauty as ascribed by Burke, and that of astonishment and mystery, albeit Kant believes in the idea of the sublime rather than the object manifestly representing beauty. Within the context or terms of the hyperreal follies, both these positions can be supported and scrutinized by the investigation of the hyperreal spatial qualities. The methods by which a dialectic twofold heterogeneous interpretation of assemblage will be used firstly of the terminology and meaning within the field of art theory, synonymous with pastiche, montage, and collage, and the urban cityscape. Assemblage draws insights and multiple readings or narratives dependent on the intent and the designed output for the digital architectural representation. Digital architecture or hyperreal follies have become pervasive and ubiquitous in the search for questing spatial properties, and it is anticipated there will be commonalities across the case studies as well as new narratives with which to invest the significance of these investigations, which would be to understand further both the delusion concept of assemblage or agement within the hyperreal follies and the expanding of the understanding of spatial qualities. Photography and architecture share an uncomfortable symbiotic codependent relationship. Paradoxically, while architects progressively use photographic imagery to showcase and describe buildings for actual construction, the images used in their presentations abound with hyperreal images that do not require plausible spatial constructs. Such a relation between architecture and photography has radically subverted the telegram-style montage of the paper architecture of the 1960s and 1970s. This style is epitomized by the collage assemblages of Hans Holbein's Aircraft Carrier in the Landscape, or Archigram's Instant City by Warren Chalk, Peter Cook, Dennis Crompton, and Norm Herron, and Rum Koolhaas's Elias Angelus, Madeline Vriesendorp, and Zoe Zangelis's Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. Yet the lineage of these vanguards can be found in contemporary spatial constructs created by subversive photographers, the likes of Laurent Chaher, Dionysius Gonzalez, and Naomi Goodall. Their works are hyperreal collaged images or assemblages that break normative boundaries of spatial attributes, causing the viewer to reappraise and think their relationship with space and building. By creating a pluralistic and multi-scalar views of spatial instances, these speculative hyperreal spatial constructs move beyond the elements of a realized building, creating new relationships of space, landscape, and building. This paper ventures into the spatialities of the subversive photographers to explore the unique deployment of the transductive method. This method, which we define as a creative spatialization of the phenomenon initially described by Gilbert Simondon and latterly by Paul de Assisi and David Scott, is used by them to produce incompatible juxtapositions of heterogeneous elements and create what we describe thus forth as sublime follies. This paper foregrounds how photography has been a prime instrument for elaborating and communicating innovative spatial concepts within the field of architecture. On one hand, the architectural photography is seen as a decisive contributor to this capacity by deploying complex representative methods that blur the boundaries and operate in the liminal space of architectural conception. On the other hand, photographic representation is seen as an enabler to seamlessly merge the opposite realms of material structure and hyperreal utopia, as elaborated by Christian Farinella, Lorena Greco, and Luis Miguel Luis Arana. This paper also explores a spatial conceptual nexus that informs the photographic representation of the sublime follies, albeit focusing on one of its types, the hyperreal folly, and its unconsequential representation of space. Through a visio-centric analysis of these intentionally manipulated images, we study their visual narratives that deliberately abandon any formal attempt of documenting objectively actual architectural spaces. Brazilian Czechoslovakian-born philosopher Willem Flusser submits that the photograph, Flusser refers to the photographs as functionaries, holds a hierarchical position of power with which the audience perceives his or her worldview of the object, or in this case, the folly, and therefore cannot be a documentary, non-judgmental viewpoint. It is this dichotomy which is illustrated by French philosopher Henri Lefebvre as, wherever there is an illusion, which resides in the photographer's lens, the artist's eye and gaze, the optical and the visual world, plays an integral and integrative, active and passive part in it. It fetishizes abstraction and imposes it as the norm. It detaches the pure form from its impure content, from lived time, everyday time. This research paper aims to reconsider and synthesize the multiple relationships created by the speculative hyperreal folly to produce new understandings about the production of placeness in the hybrid spatialization of actual and digital architecture. The layer of the photograph is an expression of the lived experience, and the layer of the photograph as the conceived space are dialogically engaged in the double reading. The dissonance with which this dialectic causes on the plausibility of the object, at the same time an opening and affirmation of individuality, the lived space, and the object of enclosing formulation that overclothes the individualized, the conceived space. This dissonance exposes these representations as complex entanglements of differentiation and abstraction. As American writer Susan Sontag posits, this paper tries to reverse the notion that photography has the unappealing reputation of being the most realistic and therefore facile of the mimetic arts. The gap in this current research is addressed by this paper is the failure in mobilizing the emancipatory power of these follies, photographic follies, assemblages in architecture. Rather, it reduces them to an illustrative role that alienates and fragments its utopian dimension, described by Frederick Jameson as textualities or textual production. Theoretical studies on narrative are commonly employed to describe complex meanings informing form and materiality or architecture of complex architectural expressions or representation, and there are substantive bodies of literature advocating the capacity of assemblage theory to address systems composed of heterogeneous and incompatible elements, as for example the studies of Luis Arana and Pedro Leonito. The principal reference of our theoretical framework is that of the Deleuze-Guattarian assemblage theory. The elaboration of this theory by Manuel de Landa is adopted for this study. It is focused on the emergent properties of the concatenation relations between the heterogeneous elements, giving us effective instruments to explore the productivity of the hyperreal follies by foregrounding the effects of their association and recontextualized of reappropriated components. As originally presented in 1000 Plateaus, the main tenet of this theory is that of the forming and creating of alternative entities and possibilities occurring via a mechanism of deterrialization, which consequently formations of constellations. Within our study, the deterrialization concatenations are subject to an assemblage thinking that, as is posited by Ben Anderson, Matthew Kearns, Colin McFarlane, and others, they state, assemblage thinking offers four things to the contemporary social spatial theory that when taken together provide an alternative response to the problematic of the relational thought. An experimental realism orientated to the processes of composition, a theorization of world of relations, and that which exceeds a present set of relations, a rethinking of agency in distribution terms and causality of non-linear immanent terms, and an orientation of the expressive capacity of assembled orders that, as they are stabilized and changed. This quote's critical viewpoint is that assemblage thinking draws insights and multiple readings depending on the intent and on the designated output. Indeed, the articulation, terminology, and meaning of assemblage theory varies conjuncturally, as demonstrated by the perceptual and conceptual distinction in its adoption in different disciplinary fields. For example, within the field of art history, it is synonymous with that allegory and continued metaphor, as well as montage and collage, all pertinent to hyperreal follies. However, within the fields of geography, archaeology, and ecology, it is used to group artifacts or taxonomically similar communities. It is clearly described by Anderson et al. As a technical operator that enables heterogeneous phenomena to be classified and to be ordered. The central engine of the hyperreal folly assemblages is, according to Deleuze and Guattari, a desiring machine. This machine determines the optical or rather visual determinations and conceptions and perceptions, offering multiple readings. These readings circle around and back to the image, opening slippages, interrupting paradigms, and disrupting codings that are conventionally attributed to the intention of the image. A critical analysis of these multiple lenses or viewpoints can show that complex multidimensionality of representational, conceived, and experiential spatialities. It not only holds them together as mutually inclusive, but it also detects the potential overcoding through which these dimensions are homogenized, controlled, disciplined, and negatively reterritorialization are used and pertinent notions to describe these surreal, hyperreal follies. Portuguese architect and curator Pedro Godano posits in his essay Coming of Age on the furtive shifting nature of architectural photography. He states that architecture and photography have a deep-rooted relationship and that the adoption of photo collage as a standard design procedure or the use of photography as a privileged means. He further goes on to posit within the essay that architectural photography seems to be at a curious crossroads. While still having the built environment as its subject matter, its artistic autonomy is now arising from the ability to establish an expressive dialogue with more than a portrait of contemporary architecture and urban landscape. The assemblages can also produce negative deterrialization and create what Baudrillard defines as hypothesis, which is a plagiarization and self-recopy of anything such as vivid, picturesque descriptions of scenes, which can transform and influence the manner in which a building can be viewed, consumed, and valued. The hyperreal folly image can then become a consumption rather than any building. The photography creates a highly dominative and prescriptive view of the world that's more akin to annihilate creativity and innovation in architecture. Positive assemblages, however, can be extraordinary machines to create new worlds, whether it be fantastical or brutalist hyperreal follies, or perhaps in a way that is more to do with utopia, in that the camera shutter clicking is but part of the journey to the final image. The Photoshop and assemblage is part of the toolbox, much as like a paintbrush is to an artist. A photograph can transform and influence the way a building can be continuously reproduced and reproductive. The image becomes the production point rather than any medium for consumption. The photograph is so subjective that the assemblage creates a highly personalized viewpoint of the world, more akin to being a creator of new architecture. Ferguson states, the photograph has the ability to influence and transform the way people perceive and value a building. Lawrence Shaher, Dionysius Gonzalez, and Numi Goodall are three photographers, artists, perhaps one may call them visual interpreters, who operate in the medium of assemblage. Visual interpreters are those who operate at the intersection of the or liminality of the state of both being a photographer, artist, visual artist, and architect. Norman Denzin and Ivano Lincoln also considered the qualitative researcher as bricklayer, as a person who assembles images into montages. By using the analogue of a quilt maker, the researcher and maker is perceived as being a bricklayer, a maker of montages. Michael Crotty also uses the analogy of Denzin and Lincoln's bricklayer and binds it into Claude Levi-Strauss' book, The Savage Mind, albeit Crotty's interpretation of Levi-Strauss is that of a dialogue with materials interrogating all of the heterogeneous objects. These multitudinous references for which they source the definition of bricklayers have them established four typologies: interpretive, narrative, theoretical, and political. However, fundamentally, the bricklayer is concerned with borrowing from multiple disciplines. French artist Laurent Shaher's series, The Flying House, offers a surreal poetic viewpoint of Paris, dislocated and deterritorialized from its normative context and flying within the skies. Created contemporaneously between 2012 and 2020, they detail a nostalgic view of elements of the Parisian cityscape, a sort of hyperphantasia in one's mind eye, representation of memories connected with possibilities, details and snapshots of moments within the fabric of the cityscape, loosely tethered to the ground and reality by the power cables drifting off frame left and right. Spanish architect, artist, and photographer Dr. Dionysius Gonzalez has an extensive series of more than 25 images entitled in Spanish as Interacciones, in English, Interactions. And they offer a surreal possibility of contemporary habitable spaces, offering aesthetically crafted architectural possibilities within largely barren landscapes, not unlike built follies, but within the picturesque landscape of the 1700s and 1800s. The more recent series, Transacciones, 2014 to 2015, are colour and offer more connectedness and contact and perhaps more believability of the hyperreal folly within the landscape. The most recent imagery, Wittgenstein's Cabin, 2021, set within the Norwegian fjords and offers a beautifully crafted image, almost a 1970s version of a futuristic possibility: curves, glass, and a pod within a fjord, but could just as easily be from the set of the 1972 movie Solaris. French visual artist Numi Goodall, residing in the UK, creates fiction such as the Observatoires, 2015, in English, Observatories, which covers a range of imagery made between 2013 and 2015, which question the relationship of the built form and its relationship with the context landscape. Black and white, brutal, concrete, singular follies reside within the landscape, bisected horizontally, some with reflections in what assumes must be a fine plane of water, potentially a sandbank. Brutalism owes a nod to the types of structures one would find along the eastern English coastline and the Brittany coast of the Second World War, the pillboxes and the tiger's teeth, which were used as coastal defences. And of course, the Martello towers of the Napoleonic era, many of which are crumbling into the North Sea, all of which have elements of the folly. To conclude, Shaher, Gonzalez, and Goodall's seamlessness of their images create highly believable hyperreal assemblages, hardly like the early assemblage, both paper architecture and early composite photographs, where it's more readily apparent that the images were composites. These three visual interpreters or bricklayers of architectural possibilities are all dealing with issues of placement of disconnected collages of structures, creating new possibilities within the landscape, subsequently creating a sublime, translocalized, deterritorialized image. In fact, The fact that they draw from threads of multiple aligned disciplines, frequently using the plethora of existing images on the web, and reconstituting them into new forms adds to the narrative and discourse of both the representation of the building and that of who can generate architecture. The subsequent reading of these can be considered sublime, both gorgeously aesthetically beautiful and credible, however at the same time somehow off and somehow surreal. Both of these readings allow the viewer of true sublime architectural narratives. Thank you.